So my talk is not just about the creation of the Red Army, but also the experience of the Civil War and how this affected the Red Army for the next 20 or 30 years. So before the revolution, the Bolshevik leadership was informed about armies and how armies worked and why armies existed strictly by ideology, by social democratic ideology. Okay? They actually knew nothing about military organizations, so what they observed through the lens of ideology. But the basic understanding of armies that Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership had was that they're bad things, that countries shouldn't have armies, particularly a socialist country in a new socialist world would not need an army, and it would be dangerous to have an army. Armies, in their view, their ideology, were designed to be tools of the elites to oppress the masses. So, of course, a socialist state would not want or need an army to do that. Okay? They were also they existed to conduct imperialist wars, and a socialist state would, of course, not be doing that. Okay? An army would also be dangerous to a socialist state if it had one, because they had this fear that the military would create its own institutional identity, separate from that of the people, separate from that of the state, and seek to overthrow the state. They assumed, their ideology assumed, that armies are inherently reactionary, no matter what. Okay? The term they gave to this was Bonapartism, after the French Revolution, where Napoleon seized power through the army to overthrow the revolution. So even before the October Revolution, before this February Revolution, the attitude was if Lenin and the Bolsheviks ever seized power, there would be no army. So they made no preparations to have an army. Okay? After the February Revolution and Lenin's return to Russia in March, well, of course, this is a different situation. Russia was at war. Okay? So you would think, well, if they're going to seize power, the Bolsheviks would need an army. And yet Lenin and Trotsky and the leadership said, no, there will be no need for an army. Because the Bolshevik revolution, when we seize power, will lead to world revolution. And the world revolution would create a world of socialist states, and there would be no fighting amongst them, so there would be no need for an army. Okay? So between April, when Lenin returns, and the October Revolution in November, there was no planning for an army. There just would not need to be one. After the success of the October Revolution, after the Bolshevik coup succeeded, and the country is at war, they still did not prepare to have an army. Okay? They immediately opened up negotiations with the Germans and Austrians, the Central Powers, to effect a truce. So they had an armistice for 90 days, which they fully expected would yield peace. So then again, peace, no need for an army. Okay. Finally, in January of 1918, the peace talks not successful, beginning to look like they would not be successful. Lenin, the Bolshevik leadership, finally decided they should think about having an army. And this was very uncomfortable for them. They did really not want to have an army. But they thought we just might have to go against our ideology for practical purposes. So they had several meetings. They sat down to talk about this, and they agreed that they would create an army, but it would be an army of a new type, a completely different army that had ever existed in the world. It wouldn't be a hierarchy with elites dominating the masses. It would be a people's army, a citizens' army of equals, working together with class consciousness guiding their actions. Okay. Now, this would seem to be a very brave, very bold decision to create something entirely new against all the evidence of military history that showed armies acting and being organized hierarchically in other ways. Okay. But I would argue this was not a bold or brave move at all, because for it to be brave, they would have to have known what they were doing. They'd have to know they were challenging military history and czarist military history, but they were completely ignorant. They did not know anything real about armies. So this made it actually easier to do this, because they weren't afraid of making mistakes because they had no idea what they were doing. Okay. So they decided that they would recruit only class-conscious workers and maybe just 300,000, but all they would need. Okay. And again, this is bizarre thinking. They're at war with Germany and Austria, who have millions of troops arrayed against them, and they think with 300,000 class-conscious workers, this would be sufficient to defend the revolution? Okay. Well, they put the call out for volunteers. Again, only a volunteer army would suit a socialist republic. Okay. 20,000 workers, vagrants, thieves, people of ill repute volunteered, maybe hoping for a paycheck, maybe bored, maybe unemployed, we don't know. It was very disappointing in January of 1918 with this army. So this was not enough. He understood that. Lenin understood that. So they decided to recruit the Red Guards. These were the voluntary workers' organizations that were created during the revolution to secure the neighborhoods against the czarist police, to consolidate the revolution on a local basis. So they recruited them. And these were volunteers, mostly class-conscious workers, okay? But still, maybe 50,000. Okay? The peace talks failed with the Germans, and the Red Guards went into action, actually in a few weeks before the peace talks failed, fought the Germans, and it was a disaster. The Red Guards, completely inept, no leadership, no competence, and the Germans, made very easy work of them and routed them, inflicted massive casualties, and the Red Guard army, the citizens' militia, just disintegrated and ran home. Okay. At that point, so now we're talking February 1918, Lenin decided, okay, we will have to set aside ideology for now, okay, and create a real traditional army with commanders and hierarchy and consequences for disobedience. And we'll also be unable to rely on volunteers. That had been proven. So conscription. This would include peasants who were not class conscious, not in the way the Bolsheviks would want. Okay. It was beginning to look like the old Tsarist army. Okay. In fact, once they started conscripting these peasants and some workers, it became very clear that the Bolshevik leaders that volunteered to take charge of this had no idea what to do. Okay. Leon Trotsky, of course, was the one put in charge of this. Okay. Whenever Lenin didn't know what to do, he would turn to Trotsky and say, you do that, I'm going to watch you. Okay. So Trotsky realized, quite astute, he knew he did not know what to do with these men and how to create an army. But he knew who did, the old Tsarist officers. So he asked for volunteers from the Tsarist officers. Okay. And in fact, several thousand, a few thousand, did volunteer to serve. But not to serve the Bolsheviks in their minds, but to serve Russia, to defend Russia. Okay. Well, they got things organized, but it was still not enough. They needed organization, they needed administration, and they needed men to lead and to train the soldiers. So at that point, Trotsky convinced Lenin to let him actually conscript the former Tsarist officers. And they called them military specialists. Voenspetsy was the term they used. So they actually forced Tsarist officers, from generals down through lieutenants, to serve the Bolshevik army under penalty of death or imprisonment of their families if they resisted. And some officers did and were shot on the spot for that. Well, this created more problems. Now we have not just, we have some class-conscious workers, volunteers, a few. We have many peasants who are indifferent or even hostile to the Bolsheviks, and they're being organized and administered and led by the class enemy. This is not what the ideologies predicted would happen. Okay, so this is, again, a very uncomfortable situation. And many in the party objected to this. It would be better to just have a guerrilla partisan war than to trust the class enemy to run their army for them. Well, Lenin overrode those objections in favor of Trotsky, which earned Trotsky some enemies, of course, in the party. But to reassure the party that this would be acceptable in the short term, they created the position of commissars, mimicking the French Revolution, the commissionaires. Right? So every commander, every Tsarist or even not a Tsarist commander, would have a partner, not a subordinate, but a partner, a commissar, who would lead with him, that a commander's orders would not be valid until the commissar, a trusted, ideologically motivated Bolshevik or friend of the Bolsheviks, signed those orders. So this would ensure conformity to the dictates of the Communist Party to the Central Command. Okay? That was the hope. Okay. So they began the war. Well, they ended up actually not using this army against the Germans because they ended up signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March, which obviated that this army go into action right away, which was a blessing, a stroke of luck for the Bolsheviks, because it would have been a disaster, I'm sure. So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk took Russia out of the war, so maybe now they don't need an army anymore and the class enemy to lead it, okay, already in March, after just a month of the army being in existence. But by that time, actually the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, we see triggers the Civil War. So opposition within Russia against the Bolshevik power made the continuation of this army necessary. Okay? Again, to the dismay of Lenin, the Bolshevik leadership, and the average Russian worker. They didn't like this idea. So they have to keep this army, okay, to preserve Bolshevik power, to defend the revolution against counter-revolution. Okay? This army swelled to be up to 5 million men, a huge army. Okay? As big, it's about as big as the Tsarist army had been in the last year of the war, right about there. Okay? So this is a huge organizational task to keep track of this army and to feed it and to equip it and to make it obey. Okay? And the Bolsheviks were not very good at this, okay? At feeding it especially. In fact, the army ended up having to feed itself. That at any given time, it's like 75% of the army was just collecting food from the peasants to feed itself, and some for the cities. Okay? So the actual army that engaged in the Civil War and fought the White Army, the reactionaries, was very small. Okay? And that was manageable. Okay? And the type of people who rose to lead it, other than the Voenspetsy, the old Tsarist officers, were ideologically pure Bolsheviks, or newly so, some old Bolsheviks and many new Bolsheviks, but people who wanted the party to succeed, young guys. Okay? And because of this, with no military experience, basically, except maybe as privates or as sergeants, okay, a handful of lieutenants. Okay. The Civil War was conducted on a very amateurish basis. Okay. The white armies against the Red Army, very small, ill-equipped. The Allies were not, very good at keeping them up to standards there, and there was corruption amongst them. So it was two weak forces, sort of disorganized, fighting fairly small-scale battles. Nothing compared to World War I in size. Maybe 50,000 men combined on the battlefield. This is small stuff, okay? Using primitive tactics, artillery in sight of the enemy. So you see them and shoot them. Some machine guns, no aircraft, no tanks. Cavalry, using cavalry to charge infantry. So a very unsophisticated war that really offered no lessons for higher military strategy or thought. So the military experience of the war for commanders was no preparation for a real war down the road. Okay. But even on this amateur basis, with this huge army, the new leadership felt overwhelmed because they were untrained, inexperienced, didn't really know what they were doing. And because of this, their behavior towards their subordinates and towards the soldiers, unfortunately, reverted to the same type of behavior that the old Tsarist army had exhibited. That officers, senior officers, would slap and punch their subordinates for, out of anger. The junior officers would slap, kick, punch their subordinates, mostly the peasants. The working class officers, or they called them commanders. They were forbidden to use the word officer. But the commanders would take out their anger, because their inability to communicate what they wanted to do by physically being brutal to their subordinates. Very much like the Tsarist army. Again, the ideology was like equal citizens, no hierarchy, no violence, and now they are doing exactly the opposite of what they thought was the right thing to do because of the force of circumstances and their complete unpreparedness to have an army. They hadn't even thought about having an army. Okay. Well, they won the war, not because of any military brilliance or organizational capacity on their part, but they won the war. It kind of was over about 1921, early 1922. They wrapped it up in Siberia. Okay. And they had to address the question once again. The party revisited the question. Do we want to keep an army now that the revolution is established? Okay. Well, no world revolution had happened. They are confronted by capitalist states on their borders that had been there, obviously. And a real debate raged within the party, and they finally resolved it, I think, the 10th Party Congress. But there were those in the party who said, okay, no more army. We're done. We'll be a peaceful socialist state. Okay. But there were those in the army, the new commanders, the Bolshevik commanders, okay, and some of the Voenspetsy, the old officers who had joined the party or sworn loyalty to the revolution because they didn't want to have to get any other job. They knew how to be soldiers, who argued, no, we need to keep the army. Okay. And this was a very difficult debate because people wanting to keep the army were going against the ideology. But very, very practical. As a new state with capitalist neighbors, it would be a wise thing to have the ability to defend oneself. Whereas the party members who argued against having an army, well, they had ideology on their side. Marx said. Hey, what else do you need? Okay. So they reached a compromise that they would have a small regular army, about 500,000 troops, which is the smallest army Russia had had in probably 40 years. It had never been that small. Okay. But they would also have a citizens' militia, the equal, working, class-conscious people together, as a reserve for the small army in case it went to war, but also as a force that could defend the revolution against the regular army if it became reactionary. So an army against this army, army with the army, just to see how things would work out. Okay. So they agreed to do this, and they had a very large citizens militia, several millions, that trained in the local areas on every summer, a couple weekends during the year, to prepare the citizenry for mobilization if it should come to it. And this was acceptable to the majority of Russians, the majority of Soviet citizens. They could handle that. Okay, they still were not comfortable with this regular army. And another issue that came up at the party congress: do we keep the Vojenspetsy? Do we keep the class enemy? Vigorous debate about that, and they agreed, yes, we will keep them, but only some of them. They dismissed many, just as many as they needed for this smaller army. But that decision was, it carried, they agreed, but it was very uncomfortable. There were members of the party who voted against that and were not happy. And they always kept in the back of their mind, this army, just because it's a regular army, is a dangerous thing. Bonapartism still could happen. Okay? We still have the class enemy leading this army. That's not good. Okay? So a significant portion of the Bolshevik Party was not comfortable with this regular army. Meanwhile, the officers in the regular army began to actually sort of fulfill the fears that ideology set out for them, that they wanted to have a real regular army with ranks and titles, insignia, strict discipline, okay, defined career patterns, okay, and they didn't want to have this commissar watching them. They debated that, and they voted on it. Okay. The vote was again a compromise. They would keep the commissars. Okay. They create a political administration that answered to the party, okay, but worked within the army. But the commissars would not command together. They would be separate. Not subordinate, but equal, but no signing the orders. Okay? And their job was to turn the regular army into a school of socialism. That the army would be a vehicle to educate the peasant masses primarily into the wonderful benefits of socialism and the October Revolution and the great Lenin. And so when they finished their term in the military, they could take this message to the village and educate their peers. The revolution, it's a good thing. Lenin's great. It's all going to work out. Okay? That was the hope. Okay? Also, during the Civil War and after, there was the issue of the special sections. And we heard Nikita talk about the CHK and then the OGPU, that during the war, the secret police had an officer, a representative at every regiment and at every division. to guard against counter-revolution, okay, but also to serve as the military police. Okay. The Russian army then, before the war, before the revolution, during the Soviet period, and now, has never had its own military police. They've always relied on civilian authorities to mobilize and support them. Even under the Tsar, the secret police had informers in their ranks, and the army didn't like that. Well, they're continuing the same behaviors. Okay. Well, this issue came up. The army didn't want the secret police in the army, and they lost that one. The secret police would stay. The political administration with the commissars, they would stay. Okay. And so there was tension within the army against the party for these decisions. Okay. That the new, even revolutionary Bolsheviks who decided to make their career in the army began to think like army officers and not so much like Bolsheviks. Okay. This is the great worry of the Bolsheviks. Okay. So there's this tension. Throughout the 1920s, this tension existed between the party and the army, within the party. Okay. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks still wanted to make this army different, a new type. Okay. They gave up the idea of egalitarian relationships and admitted that the officers did need to have authority. Not ranks or titles, but just authority. But they would be called comrade commander. This would make it seem better. Okay. But the commander was a commander, so that they were to be obeyed. But the discipline was very light. Okay. And they actually did succeed for a brief period in Russian military history in eliminating violence against the soldiers. This is a real credit to them, that they really made a successful effort to tell the superiors, don't hit people. Send them to the guardhouse. Counsel them. Educate them. But don't hit people anymore. Okay? That's over now, but they really got that to happen. And this was a change the peasants took back to the village, because they knew their fathers and had these horror stories about the army. But now that was different for Russia, to treat the men with respect, okay, to give them light discipline, which again, the officers seeking to make a career, they didn't like that. It's like they really wanted to just I should be able to hit a soldier who mouths off to me, talks back, and I should be able to sentence them to harsher discipline than a day in the guardhouse, which is a day off of duty. It's pretty easy to do behavior. So again, there's this tension. In the 1930s, okay, the drive to become professional intensified. Such people as Frunze, Frunze died in 1925, but he was on the way. Tukhachevsky, he was a well-regarded, he actually became a marshal of the Soviet Union, but he was a voenspetsy, he was from the nobility, but a professional soldier who really wanted the Red Army to be a professional army. He had a cohort of very professionally minded people, mostly voenspetsy, but a few newcomers to that, really were pressing the party all the time. Get rid of the political administration, give us titles of rank, okay? Give us nice fancy uniforms, give us special privileges, because we're officers, we need the status to lead. Even such Bolsheviks as Voroshilov and Kulik and Budyeni, they wanted fancy uniforms and saluting and shoulder boards and all the things the party didn't want. So the tension increased in the 1930s. Okay. But finally, Stalin, now as the leader, relented. And in the mid-30s, the officers got titles. Comrade lieutenant, comrade captain, comrade colonel, not comrade commander. Okay. They got fancy uniforms, they got higher pay, they got special privileges before the law. They were becoming more of an elite, a military elite, just as was feared. Okay? The fear of Bonapartism was still in the party, and Tukhachevsky was seen as a potential Bonaparte, okay, by some, including Stalin. Stalin, it's a very important point I need to make. Stalin was a veteran of the Civil War. Stalin did not wear a military uniform, but he did hold command positions. He was sent to various fronts with power to make decisions, and power that he usually abused and overstepped, but he had to deal with the Voenspetzi, and he didn't like that. He had conflict with them. The battle of the siege of Tsaritsyn is a famous case where he clashed with the military and used the party power. So Stalin had experience with the Civil War, with the idea of the egalitarian army, the ideology, and then the class enemy officers, and he never was comfortable with that. Well, now he's the leader in the mid-30s. Okay? He gives them these special privileges, but this raises his suspicions, okay? Which makes it easier for Yezhov, who we learned about earlier, to deliver to Stalin a dossier, the origins of which we still do not know, okay, that implicated Tukhachevsky and others, other of the more professional leadership. It accused them of being in league with Germany, Nazi Germany, to overthrow Soviet power. It's completely false, but this dossier existed. We don't know where it came from. There are many theories, but it ended up with Yezhov, who then took it to Stalin. And Stalin accepts it as true. Right? Because ideology, fear of Bonapartism, his experience in the Civil War, all made it plausible to him. Okay? And this actually, so with this, the Tukhachevsky, his followers are then arrested and executed, and the Great Terror really takes off with the purge of the military, and then it spreads to society. Okay? Again, the party, and this is accepted by a lot of the party. When Tukhachevsky is accused of being counter-revolutionary and other former white officers or former Tsarist officers, it makes sense to so many Bolsheviks who were always suspicious. Okay? They didn't really question it. It's like, of course, they are the class enemy. They want these special privileges. They want power to control the army. So, of course, they would use this against the party. Okay? So again, the ideology, the inexperience with the armies, how they're organized and why they have powers that they do, and the experience of the Civil War reinforces this and leads to the Great Terror and the decapitation of the leadership of the professional leadership of the Red Army. Okay. During the time of terror, after the Night of the Terror, Stalin reimposes the dual command. Now the commissars, once again, are equal and have to sign. The commander's orders are no longer valid without the commissar's signature, just like the Civil War. Stalin is calling back to his experience in the Civil War, okay, where the party was in charge and made the decisions of everything. Okay. Well then, the World War II starts. Invasion of Poland, the war with Finland, and things go poorly. Okay. Keeping in mind, I'm going to use the word emergency. So the Red Army was created in a period of emergency in 1918. So they had to do things against their will and quickly without a lot of thought. Well, now World War II has created another emergency. Okay. And so Stalin treats the Red Army in World War II as, in the case of an emergency, how he had experienced the emergency in 1918 through the Civil War. Okay. He's a veteran, he was there, He is reacting true to form. This should not be a surprise. Okay? The most significant act that he committed that harkens back to the Civil War was the publication, I believe it was in August of 1941, Order Number 270, okay, which authorized, even instructed, commanders to execute soldiers, subordinates for cowardice. Okay. This was practiced during the Civil War. That when somebody failed in battle, it was never because of incompetence, lack of training, lack of supervision, lack of experience. It was always cowardice. Okay? And Order Number 270 didn't talk about treason, it talked about cowardice. So anytime a retreat turned into a rout in the face of the German attack, that was seen as cowardice on the part of the commanders. And so thousands of commanders were arrested, put on tribunals. Others were just shot on the spot. But also, now they began to shoot their subordinates to protect themselves. Like, well, it was his fault, I shot him, so we're okay. Don't shoot me. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands of men were shot August, September, October 1941 in an imitation of the emergency of 1918, only worse. A larger scale, a larger war, a more dreaded enemy, Nazi Germany. Okay. Here we see, even this is Stalin. The Red Army generals, even the old Bolsheviks, objected to this, to his face. They said, this is not right. This is not how armies are supposed to work. This is not the Civil War. We need to stop this. It took them until October, but finally Stalin, he did not rescind the order. Stalin never rescinded an order. He passed a new order, urging caution and discretion in the execution of people for cowardice. But it was still permissible, but it was now be more discreet about it. Okay? So the real legacy of the creation of the Red Army in the state of emergency and the experience of the Civil War rested in Stalin. He is the one who carried it through to 1941 in his fear of Bonaparte. You can even say till 1946, when he reassigned Zhukov to an obscure military post out of fear that he would be a new Bonaparte because of his success in World War II. Okay? So the rest of the army didn't really want to do these things. It was Stalin and his experience from 1918, 1919, 1920 that brought the Civil War to World War II and mayhem to the Red Army in 1937, 1941, and 1942. Thank you.